Charlotte Hayes nearly died inside a locked server room at the hands of a man she trusted. What pulled her back from the edge wasn't the police, wasn't luck. It was a billionaire who shouldn't have even known she existed. Damian Moretti runs Blackridge Technologies from a glass tower above Manhattan. He also runs something far older, far darker, and far more powerful beneath it. Charlotte thought surviving was the hard part. She had no idea the man who saved her life was about to change everything about it, and that the enemy she thought she'd escaped was just getting started. If this story already has you locked in, hit that like button right now and drop your city in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now let's get into it. The server room on the 41st floor of Blackridge Technologies had no windows. That was the first thing Charlotte Hayes had told herself when she agreed to stay late. No windows meant no one could see her working, which meant no one could give her grief about clocking out past midnight again. That logic made sense at 8 o'clock. By 11:15, alone in a corridor of humming black server towers, with the ventilation system cycling cold air across the back of her neck, it felt less like reasoning and more like something she'd told herself to feel safe. She wasn't entirely wrong to want that. Feeling safe at Blackridge had become a quiet, ongoing project. Charlotte was 31 years old. She had spent 4 years at the company climbing from junior analyst to senior cybersecurity engineer, which at Blackridge meant she was one of maybe 6 women in a technical role above associate level. She had a desk in a shared office on the 39th floor, a badge that gave her access to more systems than most of her male colleagues with twice her tenure, and a reputation for being relentlessly competent in a way that made people either respect her or resent her with very little middle ground. She had learned to read the room fast. She had learned to arrive early and stay late and never complain out loud about either. She had learned to take up exactly the amount of space her work required and no more. She had also learned over the last 4 months to be aware of Logan Mercer, not in any dramatic way. It hadn't started dramatically. Logan was a senior engineer, 40 years old, good-looking in a way he clearly knew and used, with the kind of easy confidence that came from never being told no often enough. He was technically skilled and politically savvy and had a habit of materializing near Charlotte's workstation in the way some men do, plausible deniability built into every appearance, just passing through, just grabbing coffee, just checking on the migration timeline. She had tried once, early on, to explain the feeling to her friend Priya over drinks. The way she had to account for where Logan was in any given room. The way her shoulders came down an inch whenever he left. Priya had listened and asked if he'd actually done anything, and Charlotte had said no, nothing she could name, and Priya had said that kind of thing was exhausting to carry. It was. Charlotte agreed. She carried it anyway. Tonight, Logan Mercer was not supposed to be in the building. She had checked the access log before she started the migration. It was a habit, one she'd developed without consciously deciding to. Logan's badge had been scanned out at 6:42 p.m. She had noted it and let her shoulders drop and gotten to work. The server migration was 3 weeks overdue, delayed by a cascade of sign-off failures and last-minute specification changes from the infrastructure team. Charlotte had finally gotten full authorization that morning and had volunteered to run the initial phase overnight because the daytime window was too operationally risky, and she was, frankly, the only person on her team she trusted to do it cleanly. She had her laptop open on a rolling cart, 3 terminal windows running, a thermal mug of coffee going lukewarm on the rack beside the door, and the focused, unhurried rhythm of someone who had done this long enough to do it well. She was 70 minutes in when the door opened. She didn't turn around immediately. The door behind her was the only entrance to the room, controlled by key card, and she heard the magnetic lock disengage and heard the door push inward and heard footsteps on the perforated floor panels. She assumed it was building security doing a circuit check. She stayed focused on her terminal. "Charlotte?" She turned then. Logan Mercer was standing 4 feet inside the door in dark jeans and a gray pullover, his badge clipped to his collar. His expression was the expression she had spent 4 months reading, carefully neutral, with something operating just beneath the surface of it that she could never quite name out loud in a way anyone would believe. "Logan," she kept her voice even, "I checked the log. You signed out at 6. Came back." He moved another step into the room and let the door swing closed behind him. The magnetic lock re-engaged with a sound that Charlotte felt rather than heard. "Forgot something." The room was long and narrow. 6 rows of server towers on each side, a cold aisle in the center, her cart about halfway down on the right. The ceiling was low. The ventilation was loud enough to swallow sound. And the access log on her laptop, she now understood, had been correct when she checked it, but it was also not a live feed. Whatever she had confirmed at 9:45 p.m. was already 40 minutes old. "What did you forget?" she asked. He didn't answer. He was looking at her in a way she recognized now, though she had never let herself name it before because naming it meant it was real, and if it was real, she would have to act on it, and acting on it meant risk. Logan's gaze moved over her with a slow, deliberate quality, like he was taking inventory. "You're always here late," he said. "You know that? Every time I've ever had a late night here, I come up to 41 and you're working." Charlotte set her hands lightly on the rolling cart. "I'm in the middle of a migration window. If you need something from the room, grab it and I'll pause the process while you're accessing anything load-bearing." "I don't need anything from the room." The way he said it made her stomach drop. She knew in the next 3 seconds that nothing about the next several minutes was going to be what she wanted it to be. She had the cart between them. She had her phone in the right pocket of her jacket. She had access to the room's emergency communication panel mounted at the far end of the row to her left, which was approximately 30 feet away. She calculated all 3 of these things in the time it took Logan to take another step forward, and she understood with a cold, clarifying certainty that the calculation wasn't going to be enough. "Logan." She made her voice flat. Flat was the register that sometimes worked. Flat meant she wasn't scared, even when she was. "I need you to leave the room." "I've been patient with you," he said. The words landed strangely. Patient. As if waiting was something he had done on her behalf, as if his restraint had been a courtesy extended to her. "I'm not interested," she said. "I've never been interested. You need to leave. You never gave it a real chance." He was still moving, slowly but moving, angling toward her side of the cart rather than the center of the aisle, cutting off the most direct path to the door. "You're like this with everyone, Charlotte. You close off. I've watched you. I know you." She thought, "He's watched you." She filed that and kept her face steady. "Step back," she said. He didn't. She moved first, around the near end of the cart, away from him, toward the emergency panel. She made it 6 feet before his hand closed around her arm from behind. His grip was hard and his other arm came across her chest from behind, and she drove her elbow back hard into his ribs and felt him grunt, and his grip shifted but didn't release, and they were moving, stumbling against the side of a server tower. And the edge of the rack caught her left shoulder and she felt the impact up into her neck. She opened her mouth to scream, and then something happened that was separate from Logan entirely, which was that her lungs stopped cooperating. Charlotte had lived with asthma since she was 9 years old. She knew her triggers precisely: cold air, exertion, stress, all 3 at once. The server room ran at 68 degrees. She had been working for over an hour, and now her body was dumping adrenaline into a respiratory system that responded to adrenaline the way most people's didn't. The first sign was the tightening, a band across her chest just below her sternum, and she recognized it with a kind of desperate, furious clarity. Not now. Not here. Not like this. She got one hand to her jacket pocket and felt the outline of her rescue inhaler and managed to half pull it free before Logan twisted her around and the inhaler hit the floor somewhere in the dark between server racks. She heard it skitter. She heard herself try to draw breath and get half of what she needed. Logan stopped when he heard her breathing. It was not concern. She would think about his expression later, in the hospital, and she would understand that what crossed his face in that moment was not concern, but recalculation. He was working out what a medical event meant for him, whether it changed his timeline, whether it created an opportunity or a complication. She was on her knees against the base of a server rack. She had her phone out. She didn't remember taking it out. And her hands were shaking badly, and the screen was blurring because her oxygen wasn't right, and she was fighting very hard against the animal panic that wanted to take over her body completely. She got the screen unlocked. She didn't try to dial. There was no time to dial and explain and wait. She opened the emergency services app she had installed after the last bad attack 2 years ago, the one that broadcast GPS and a pre-recorded distress message with one press, and she pressed it with her thumb and set the phone face up on the floor where Logan couldn't easily step on it without seeing it. Logan crouched in front of her. Up close, his face was careful and tight. "Hey," he said softly, like he was helping. Hey, you need to slow down. She looked at him over the top of the hand she'd pressed to her sternum. What she wanted to say was several different things. What she had the breath for was none of them. She focused on pulling air through the narrow space her bronchial system was currently willing to allow. And she thought about the 41 floors between her and the street, and she thought about the access log and whether the security desk monitored it in real time, and she thought about her inhaler somewhere on the dark floor behind him. Logan reached out and took her chin in his hand, tilting her face up. His touch was measured, deliberate, possessive, in the specific way of someone who had spent a long time imagining exactly this. She couldn't fight him, not right now, not with her lungs like this. She closed her eyes and focused on her breath and thought, someone will come. She didn't believe it exactly, but she thought it. The door to the server room blew open. Not opened, blew. The reinforced door with its magnetic lock and its security-rated frame hit the wall with a concussive force that she felt in her teeth, and the sound of it knocked Logan backward onto his heels. And for a moment, Charlotte thought the ventilation system had failed catastrophically, thought something structural had given, and then a man was in the doorway. She didn't know him. That was the first thing. She had worked at Blackridge Technologies for 4 years, and she had attended every all-hands and sat in enough executive briefings to have a visual catalog of the senior leadership team and most of the board. And she had never seen this man in person. She had seen his photograph. Everyone at Blackridge had seen his photograph. It was on the company website under a 3-paragraph biography that told you almost nothing about him. Damian Moretti was 44 years old. He was 6'2", and built in a way that had nothing to do with vanity, the kind of physical presence that came from a life where the body was a tool kept in a particular state of readiness. He was wearing a dark suit, no tie, the collar open, the way someone dressed when they left a meeting fast. His jaw was set, and his dark eyes were moving across the room with a focused, assessing quality that Charlotte recognized not as the look of a man assessing a situation, but as the look of a man confirming what he had already assessed before he came through the door. He had a phone in his left hand. The emergency app, she understood. He had been alerted. But that didn't explain how he had gotten here. From wherever in the building or the city he had been to the 41st floor server room in, she tried to calculate and couldn't. It had been minutes, maybe less. Logan had gotten to his feet. He was facing Damian Moretti with the wary, recalibrating expression of a man who had just understood that his night had changed categories entirely. "Who the hell are you?" Logan said. Damian Moretti didn't answer him. He walked past him. He came directly to Charlotte, crouched to her level, and did something she didn't expect. He spoke to her first. Not to Logan, not to the room, to her. "Can you stand?" His voice was low and even. Not gentle exactly, but deliberate in a way that felt directed. Like he was choosing each word specifically for her, not for the situation. She nodded. She wasn't sure it was true. He put one hand under her arm and helped her up, and she was upright, and then Logan moved, and what happened next was the most efficient act of violence Charlotte had ever witnessed in her life. She would replay it later with the helpless, slightly nauseated quality of something witnessed from too close. Damian turned and Logan swung, and then Logan was on the floor. She wasn't entirely sure what had happened in between. She caught the general shape of it. Logan's arm intercepted and redirected, weight shifted, something applied to a joint at a particular angle. Force delivered in a direction the body wasn't built to absorb. But the specifics were gone. It had taken less than 3 seconds. Logan made a sound that she recognized as involuntary, and was crumpled between 2 server racks with his face against the perforated floor. Damian turned back to her. "Your inhaler," he said. "Where?" She pointed roughly toward where she'd heard it skitter. He moved along the base of the rack without urgency, checking the floor with his phone's flashlight in a methodical sweep, and found it in 11 seconds. He crossed back and put it in her hand. She used it. 2 doses. She stood with her back against the server rack and felt her lungs begin, grudgingly, to renegotiate. Damian Moretti stood 3 feet away and watched Logan Mercer on the floor and said nothing. His hands were at his sides. His expression was not angry, exactly. It was the expression of a man who had already moved past anger into something colder and more considered. "He's still breathing," she heard herself say. "I know." He glanced at her sideways. Do you want him to keep doing that? Charlotte stared at him. Something shifted in his expression, not quite amusement. The question, she realized, had not been rhetorical, or at least he'd delivered it without indicating it was. She didn't know what to make of that. She filed it alongside everything else she didn't know what to make of. Yes, she said. I want him kept breathing, and I want him arrested, and I want this entire night on record. That works, Damien said. He made a phone call. It lasted 40 seconds. He didn't identify himself to whoever answered. He gave the floor and room number and said, bring the security team and call police and have someone meet the paramedics at the lobby, and then he hung up and looked at Charlotte. You should sit down, he said. I'm fine standing. He didn't argue. He didn't tell her she didn't look fine, which was what she expected. He simply accepted it and turned back to monitor Logan, who was not moving with any particular purposefulness on the floor. She looked at Damien Moretti standing in the cold white light of the server room and tried to assemble a sentence that made sense. She was 31 years old. She had never fainted in her life. She had never cried at work. She had spent 4 years building a professional reputation that was built in part on the consistent performance of composure. And right now, composure was a thing she was holding together with the thin, trembling wire of sheer stubbornness. You own this company, she said. I do, he said. You got here and... She stopped. How did you get here that fast? He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I was already in the building. At 11:30 at night. I work late, he said. It was true enough. She had heard that about him. That he kept unusual hours. That the executive floor sometimes showed lights past midnight. She had never thought much about it. Now she stood in the server room with a man unconscious on the floor between them and her lungs slowly reclaiming their full range, and she looked at Damien Moretti and tried to understand what it meant that he had come himself. Not sent security, come himself. She didn't get to finish the thought. The door opened and 4 men came through it. Large men in Blackridge security uniforms, moving with the coordinated efficiency of people who had been briefed before they entered. 2 of them went directly to Logan. 1 stationed himself by the door. The 4th came to Damien and spoke quietly to him for 30 seconds. Charlotte watched Damien listen. He nodded once. He said 3 words she couldn't hear over the ventilation system. Then the paramedics were there, and she was the one they moved toward. And the next hour became the controlled chaos of emergency care and police and statements and fluorescent lights in an ambulance bay, and she lost track of Damien Moretti somewhere in the transition between the server room and the stretcher. She was treated for the asthma attack and for a bruised shoulder and for the effects of what the attending physician called acute stress response, in the careful, clinical language of someone trained to be precise about things that felt enormous. A detective named Ramirez sat beside her bed with a notepad and asked her to describe the sequence of events, and she described them fully, without hedging, including the 4 months of preceding behavior she had documented in her own head, even if nowhere official. Ramirez wrote everything down. Has Mercer approached you before tonight? He asked. Yes, she said. Nothing I could prove. Tonight, I can prove. Ramirez nodded. We'll need your phone. The emergency broadcast. That's going to be important. I know, Charlotte said. She had kept the phone. It was in her jacket pocket, which was folded on the chair beside the bed. She handed it over and watched Ramirez bag it, and she felt something settle in her chest that was not relief, but was adjacent to it, the solid, flat weight of evidence. Priya arrived at 1 a.m. and sat with her and said very little, which was exactly right. Charlotte sat on the edge of the hospital bed with a heated blanket over her shoulders and tried to process the fact that she was in a hospital at all, that the evening had gone the direction it had gone, that Logan Mercer had been in the building, that Damien Moretti had come through a reinforced door like it was a suggestion. He didn't come see me, she said at some point, to Priya. After. He was just gone. The billionaire guy? He owns the company. He came to the server room himself, and then he disappeared. Priya looked at her for a moment. Do you want him to have come to see you? Charlotte thought about it. I don't know, she said honestly. I just don't understand why he came himself in the first place. That question went with her when she was discharged at 3 a.m. It went with her in Priya's car and up the stairs to her apartment and into the sleepless 2 hours she spent on her couch watching the light change on the ceiling. She was not a woman who believed much in coincidence. She was a woman who believed in data and patterns and the meaning embedded in behavior And the behavior she kept returning to was this. A man who controlled a billion-dollar technology company had been in his own building at 11:30 at night, had responded to an emergency alert triggered by a junior employee he had no documented relationship with, had personally handled a physical threat, had found her inhaler on a dark floor, and had then vanished before she could ask a single question. She turned it over and over. She fell asleep near 5 a.m. without resolving it. At 8:47 a.m., her work phone rang. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize. She answered it because she had grown up answering phones when she didn't recognize numbers. It was the kind of thing that became a habit when you grew up waiting for calls from collection agencies or hospitals and learned that not answering didn't make anything better. Ms. Hayes. The voice was female, precise, completely neutral. This is Elena Vasquez, executive assistant to Mr. Moretti. He'd like to meet with you at 2 o'clock today if you're available. Charlotte sat up on the couch, her blanket slid off. I was discharged from the hospital 5 hours ago. Yes, Elena Vasquez said. Mr. Moretti is aware of that. Charlotte looked at the ceiling. She thought about saying no. She had reasons to say no. She was tired and her shoulder hurt, and Logan Mercer had been released on bail at 7:30 that morning. Detective Ramirez had texted her, and the combination of those facts made her feel like the floor under her feet was a less reliable surface than it had appeared. 2 o'clock, Charlotte said. Fine. She arrived at the executive floor at 1:58 in the clothes she wore to serious things, dark trousers, a structured jacket, the kind of outfit that helped her feel like herself when the context around her was uncertain. The elevator opened onto a reception area that was different in kind from every other floor of Black Ridge she had worked on. Quieter. More considered. The woman behind the desk, Elena, Charlotte assumed, was in her late 30s and had the specific composed attentiveness of someone whose job required them to assess people very quickly and very accurately. She was shown to a conference room and waited 2 minutes before Damian Moretti came in. He was in a different suit from the night before. Dark charcoal, precisely fitted, the same open collar. He looked like a man who had slept, which Charlotte resented mildly. He sat across the table from her and looked at her for a moment in a way that was not rude but was direct. "How are you?" he asked. "I'm functional," she said. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. "That's a specific answer. I'm a specific person." He nodded once. He set both hands flat on the table, which she read as a deliberate gesture, an open, visible, nothing hidden. "I want to apologize for what happened in this building, under my roof, on my watch." Logan Mercer was already posting bail at 7:30 this morning, she said. Damian's expression didn't change, but something sharpened behind his eyes. "I know. His lawyers are expensive." "I know that too." She watched him. "You're telling me he's going to be a problem." "I'm telling you that I don't want him to be your problem," Damian said. "There's a distinction." She studied the distinction. "What does that mean practically?" He was quiet for a moment, and she had the impression of a man who was deciding something, rather than someone filling conversational silence. When he spoke, it was measured. "I'd like to offer you a new position. Executive assistant to me, reporting directly. Triple your current salary, new access level, new responsibilities. Your office would be on this floor." Charlotte stared at him. "You want to promote me? I want to keep you where I can ensure your safety without having to explain it to anyone who doesn't need to know." The words were so plainly stated that she took a moment to process them. That's a very direct thing to say. "I'm a direct person." "You hid your reason inside a job title." "I gave you the job because you're the best technical analyst in this building, and I've thought that for some time," he said. "The safety consideration is real, but it's not the only reason." She looked at him for a long moment. He held her gaze without performance. No persuasion, no pressure, just waiting. "Why did you come yourself?" she asked. "Last night, to the server room." He didn't answer immediately. She watched something move through his expression, brief and controlled. "I was close," he said. "That's not an answer." "No," he said. "It's not." The room was very quiet. The ventilation on this floor ran at a different sound level, softer, less industrial. She could hear her own breathing, which was still not quite what it should be, still carrying the faint, tight quality of a respiratory system that had been through something. She looked at Damian Moretti, at the precise suit and the guarded eyes and the hands still flat on the table, and she thought about Logan Mercer out on bail somewhere in this city. She thought about her empty apartment. She thought about the calculation she'd done on the floor of the server room when she was deciding what she could reach in time. "I'll take the position," she said, "on a trial basis. And I want it in writing that the promotion is performance-based, not protective custody." "Done," he said immediately. She stood up, and he stood up, and they were the same height almost exactly. She was 5'7", and he had perhaps an inch on her. And for a moment, standing across the table from each other, there was something in the air that she didn't examine too closely. "Ms. Hayes," he said as she turned toward the door. She stopped. "Logan Mercer will not hurt you again." He said it without inflection, without emphasis, the way you state a fact you are certain of. Not a reassurance, a declaration. She looked back at him. "How certain are you of that?" His eyes were steady and dark and entirely unreadable. "Certain enough," he said. She walked out into the corridor and pressed the elevator button and stood waiting with her arms crossed over her chest and her mind working fast. She had just accepted a job from a man she didn't understand, a man who had materialized in a locked room at exactly the right moment and had taken a thread apart in 3 seconds and had looked at her on the floor of that room and found her inhaler like it was the most natural thing he'd done all night. Who is he? She thought, not for the first time. The elevator doors opened. She got in. What she didn't know, what she couldn't know, standing in that elevator with her bruised shoulder and her almost steady breathing and her new employment agreement already being drafted on the floor above her, was that Damian Moretti was not watching her leave because he was being polite. He was watching her leave because the moment she was out of his line of sight, he was going to make a phone call that would not be logged on any Blackridge system. A phone call to a man named Caruso who ran communications for a network that did not appear in any corporate filing or public record. A network that had been monitoring Logan Mercer's financial activity for 16 hours and had already found things that the police hadn't looked for yet. The things Caruso had found were not minor. And Damian Moretti, whose public biography described him as a ruthless venture capitalist from an old-money New York family, was going to have to decide in the next several hours whether what Caruso had found was something he addressed as the CEO of Blackridge Technologies, or as the man he actually was beneath that. The man that Charlotte Hayes, riding down 40 floors in a quiet elevator, did not yet know existed. The call Damian made lasted 4 minutes and 12 seconds. He knew the duration because he tracked every call made on the secured line, not out of compulsion, but because in the kind of work he did, time was evidence, and evidence was leverage, and leverage was the only currency that never lost value. He stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of his executive office with Manhattan laid out 41 floors below him and listened to Caruso talk in the flat, efficient cadence of a man who understood that what he was describing needed no editorial commentary. Logan Mercer had been skimming, not from Blackridge directly. That would have been too visible, too traceable. He had been skimming from the vendor network. 43 contractors across 11 infrastructure projects over 3 years. Invoices inflated at the line item level in amounts small enough to clear automated auditing thresholds, routed through a shell entity registered in Delaware under a name that shared no obvious connection to Mercer, except for a secondary address that matched his mother's property in Westchester. The total, as of Caruso's preliminary accounting, was somewhere between $4 and $6 million. They were still working the edges of it. There was more. There were files, archived, encrypted, stored on a private server whose IP address traced back to a residential account in Mercer's name. Caruso's people hadn't cracked the encryption yet. They were working on it. What they could see from the metadata was a filing structure that suggested organized, deliberate collection. Hundreds of files, sorted by name, women's names. Damian stood at the window for a long time after the call ended. Below him, the city moved with the indifferent momentum it always had. Traffic light refractions on wet asphalt, a siren somewhere to the south, the distant skeletal glow of the bridge. He had grown up in this city. He had inherited something in this city that most people who passed him on the street would not have believed if they'd been told directly to their faces. He had spent 20 years reshaping that inheritance into something he could live with, which was not the same as something clean, but was something with its own internal logic and its own code and its own rules about what kinds of damage were permissible and what kinds were not. He had rules about women. He had rules about civilians. He had rules about people who preyed quietly on people who had no idea they were being hunted. Logan Mercer had broken every one of them. He set the phone down on his desk and sat for a moment with his hands loose in his lap and made himself think about this the way he made himself think about everything that had the potential to make him act faster than was wise. He was not a man who acted on impulse. He was a man who understood that impulse was a liability and that the difference between a situation handled correctly and a situation that became a catastrophe was usually the 10 seconds you took before you moved. He took his 10 seconds. Then he called Caruso back and told him to get everything to his own legal team and simultaneously to the detective on the Mercer case, and to do it through the anonymous tip infrastructure they'd used twice before, and to make sure there was no fingerprint on it that led back to the syndicate or to him. He told Caruso to keep the encrypted file server under surveillance and to alert him the moment they had a crack in the encryption. Then he called Elena and told her to schedule a full security briefing for 7 a.m. Then he did something he didn't usually do, which was sit in the dark for a while and think about Charlotte Hayes on the floor of the server room with her hand pressed to her chest and the thin, determined sound of her trying to breathe through a body that was failing her, and the way she had looked at him when he crouched down and asked if she could stand. Not with relief, with assessment, like she was deciding whether he was safe. He respected that. He also found it. He searched for the word and settled on unsettling. Not because it was wrong, because it was accurate, and accuracy in that direction was something he hadn't factored into the evening. He went home at 2 a.m. and slept 4 hours and came back. Charlotte arrived on the executive floor at 8:55 a.m. on her first day in the new role. She was 3 minutes early, and she was carrying a coffee that was not from the building's cafe, which told him she had stopped somewhere on the way. She was wearing different clothes from the day before. Gray trousers, a dark blue top, the same structured jacket he'd already begun to think of as her armor. Her shoulder was visibly stiff. She was holding the coffee on her left side to compensate. He watched her through the glass partition of his office for approximately 4 seconds before he looked back at the briefing document on his desk. Because looking for longer than 4 seconds at a woman he'd just promoted was a line he had a particular interest in not crossing. Elena walked her through the floor, showed her the office, a corner room, not large but private, with a view south. Introduced her to the 2 associates she would be coordinating with. Walked her through the access protocols for the executive system. Charlotte took all of it in without writing anything down, which Damien noticed because most people wrote things down when they were new somewhere, and the ones who didn't were either supremely confident or supremely good at retention. He suspected both applied. She knocked on his office door at 9:40, and he told her to come in. She had a notepad. Not for notes. She set it on the edge of the desk, unopened. She sat across from him and crossed one leg over the other and said, "The Kellerman acquisition brief. I read the summary in the shared drive last night. The liability exposure on their legacy infrastructure is being significantly underweighted." He studied her. "You read the acquisition brief last night." "I couldn't sleep." She said it matter-of-factly. "I read the brief. The liability figure in the summary assumes a best-case remediation timeline for the network architecture vulnerabilities. That's not a realistic assumption for a company that hasn't done a meaningful security audit in 4 years. The actual exposure could be 2 to 3 times what the summary projects." Damien looked at her for a moment. Then he pulled the Kellerman file from the stack to his right and opened it. He paged to the liability section. He read what she had described. He set the file down. "Write me a revised exposure assessment," he said, "by end of day." "I'll have it to you by noon," she said. She did. It was detailed and precisely structured and contained 3 alternative scenario models with corresponding risk adjustments. And when his CFO read it at 2 p.m., he called Damien and said whoever wrote this just saved us $60 million in post-acquisition surprises, and Damien said, "I know," and hung up. That was the first week. The weeks that followed had a particular rhythm to them that Charlotte established more than he did, which was not something he was accustomed to. She managed his schedule with the brisk efficiency of someone who didn't believe in performative busyness. She sat in on board briefings and said nothing for the first 30 minutes, and then asked one question that reframed the entire discussion. She worked late without announcement and left without ceremony, and arrived before most of the floor was populated. She also, he noticed, always knew where the exits were. In any room they entered together, conference rooms, boardrooms, the lobby, her eyes moved to the exits within the first 20 seconds. He recognized the behavior because it was his own. They were 3 weeks into the arrangement when the first threat arrived. It came to her work email. The address was masked, routed through several proxy layers, which told Damien's security team it was someone with technical competence or access to someone with technical competence. The message itself was 4 words. I see you, Charlotte. Charlotte forwarded it to him without comment before the security team had flagged it. That meant she'd seen it first and had processed it and had made the decision to escalate in the time it took most people to still be deciding whether it was serious. He went to her office. She was at her desk. Her expression was the controlled, flat expression he'd come to recognize as her working face. The one that didn't tell you anything except that she was thinking faster than she was showing. How long have you had it? He asked. 8 minutes. She looked up at him. How long have you had it? 6, he said. She nodded. Logan's still in the city. His bail conditions require him to stay in state. I know where he is, Damien said. Something shifted in her expression. She caught it and smoothed it back out. The way you say that. I keep track of things that concern me. Am I one of the things that concerns you? The question came out clean, no edge to it, just direct inquiry. He considered the honest answer, which was yes, and considered whether delivering it was appropriate, and settled on a version of it. The situation concerns me, he said. You're in the situation. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked back at her screen. He sent it from a masked address, but he used the same sentence construction he used in the HR complaint. I filed 4 months ago. I can write that up as a technical and linguistic analysis if it helps the detective's case. Do that, he said. Send it to Ramirez directly. Copy my legal team. Already drafted, she said. He stood in her doorway for a second longer than was strictly necessary and then went back to his office. That evening, Caruso called again. The encrypted files on Logan's private server had been partially cracked. They were not what anyone had prepared for. The files contained photographs, surveillance quality images taken without subject awareness, collected across a period of at least 4 years. 16 women were currently identified. Charlotte was among them. Her file was larger than the others. It was also the most recent. Damien sat with that information for 3 minutes. Then he called Caruso and told him to make sure everything reached the detective's task force within the hour and to use the clean channel and to ensure nothing touched the syndicate. Then he stood at the window for a while and did not look at Manhattan. He told Charlotte the next morning. Not the syndicate connection? He would not tell her that yet, and when he eventually did, it would not be in a morning briefing. But he told her that law enforcement had received additional evidence and that the scope of Logan's activity was broader than originally understood, and that her name had appeared in material now in police custody. She listened without speaking. Her coffee sat untouched on the desk. How many women? She asked when he finished. 16 confirmed, he said. Potentially more. She was quiet for a moment, not the controlled processing quiet she usually had. This was something different, denser, heavier. He watched her work through it without offering anything, because he had learned in 3 weeks that she did not want to be managed through things. She wanted to move through them herself. He had files on me specifically, she said. It wasn't a question. Yes. For how long? The metadata suggests at least 18 months. She closed her eyes for 2 seconds, opened them. I knew something was wrong. I told people. Nothing happened. I know, he said. That's not an apology. No, it's an acknowledgement. There's a difference, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. She looked at him. The look was complicated, anger in it, and something that was not quite gratitude, but was adjacent to recognition. You're a strange man, Damien Moretti. It was the first time she'd used his name. He noted it, the way he noted things that mattered without reacting to them visibly. You're not the first person to say that, he said. I'm probably the first person to say it to your face. Possibly, he said. She picked up her coffee, took a drink, set it down. What happens now? Ramirez's task force is building a federal case. The financial fraud alone is enough for serious time. The surveillance material adds charges. With 16 women as potential witnesses, he stopped. He's not going to walk out of this. He's already walked out once, she said. He was out on bail in 12 hours. That was before, Damien said. Before the task force. Before the federal involvement. Before the full scope was in front of a judge. She considered this. You're confident. I'm realistic, he said. There's a difference. Something moved across her face. He couldn't fully read it, and he didn't try. I'm going to keep working, she said. That's what I'm going to do. I'm not going to sit somewhere waiting for a case to build. I'm going to keep working. Good, he said. He meant it. She went back to her screen, and he went back to his office. And what happened in the following 4 weeks was something he watched with the particular attention he gave to things that surprised him. Charlotte Hayes worked like someone who had been given a problem that genuinely interested her and had decided not to stop until it was solved. She took the Kellerman acquisition from preliminary assessment to full recommendation in 18 days. She rebuilt the vendor audit process that had allowed Logan's fraud to operate undetected, implemented it across 7 departments, and presented the new framework to the CFO in a 30-minute meeting that ended with the CFO saying this should have existed 5 years ago. She attended board briefings and executive calls and client meetings with equal composure and said the right thing at the right moment with the consistency of someone who operated not from strategy, but from clarity. He watched her and tried to remember the last time someone at his company had made him revise his understanding of what was possible in a role. He was also, if he was precise about it, becoming increasingly aware of her in ways that were inconvenient. The awareness was not new. He had been aware of Charlotte Hayes since before the night in the server room, though he had not done anything with that awareness and had not intended to. He had seen her present at a company-wide strategy meeting 14 months ago, a presentation on network vulnerability architecture that had been scheduled for 20 minutes and had run 40 because the board kept asking questions she kept answering better than the questions deserved. He had thought then, whoever manages her now is going to lose her in 2 years and regret it for 5. He had not thought about her in personal terms. He was disciplined about those distinctions. But the nights they worked late, which happened with increasing regularity, because his schedule didn't conform to business hours and hers apparently didn't either, had a particular quality to them that he was aware of in a way he had not accounted for. The floor emptied out. The overhead lights in the corridor shifted to their overnight setting, and Charlotte Hayes was still at her desk, jacket off, one elbow on the desk, reading something on her screen with the focused, unhurried attention she brought to everything. And sometimes they ended up in the small conference room adjacent to his office with coffee and documents spread across the table. And they talked about work, and then they talked about other things the way people sometimes do when the night gets late enough that the professional framing relaxes slightly. He learned that she had grown up in South Baltimore, that her father had died when she was 11, a work accident, a construction site, 3 days in the hospital, and then nothing. That her mother had worked 2 jobs for 6 years after, and that Charlotte had paid for 2 years of her own college before a merit scholarship covered the rest. That she had chosen cybersecurity because it was, in her words, the closest thing to a fair fight in a world where most fights weren't fair. If you were good enough, your gender and your background and your family's bank account were irrelevant. The system either worked or it didn't. He did not tell her the equivalent things about himself. Not yet. He told her enough. About his father, about inheriting a company built on other people's money in ways that weren't always ethical, about the decision he'd made in his early 30s to restructure everything and take the losses and start over with something he could justify. He did not tell her what the company had been or what still operated beneath the legitimate surface of what he'd built. He would have to tell her eventually. He knew this with the quiet certainty of someone who had assessed a situation and understood where it was going, even when nothing formal had been said. He was not ready for that conversation. He was not sure she was either. What happened on a Tuesday night in the 6th week was small and consequential in the way that small things sometimes are. They were in the conference room. It was 11 p.m. The Kellerman deal was 2 days from closing, and there was a last-minute covenant issue that his legal team had flagged, and Charlotte had been working through the technical implications for 2 hours. She had taken her jacket off, and her sleeves were rolled to the elbows, and there were 3 empty coffee cups on the table and a legal pad covered in her handwriting, and she was reading a clause on her laptop with the particular expression she had when she was about to say something that dismantled a previous assumption. The covenant language restricts us from accessing the legacy infrastructure for remediation until 18 months post-close, she said. That means we're locked into the liability exposure for a year and a half with no ability to actively reduce it. Our legal team missed that, Damien said. Your legal team was reading it as a standard non-interference clause. It's not. The carve-out language is narrower than it looks. She turned the laptop toward him and pointed to the specific clause. Here. He leaned in to read it. She was close enough that he was aware of exactly how close she was, which was something he cataloged and filed away. He read the clause. She was right. Renegotiate the carve-out before close, he said. I've already drafted the proposed revision, she said. It's in the folder. He looked at her. She looked back. In the particular exhausted late-night quiet of the room, with the city doing its distant thing outside the window, the look lasted a half-second longer than it usually did. She was the one who looked away first. She reached for her coffee and found the cup empty and made a small sound that was not quite frustration. I'll get more, he said. You don't have to. I know, he said. He went to the kitchen down the hall. He stood at the coffee machine and listened to it run and thought about the half-second and what it meant and whether it meant anything at all or whether he was constructing significance from proximity and fatigue. He brought the coffee back and set hers in front of her and sat back down, and they worked for another hour without either of them acknowledging anything. And when she finally packed her laptop at midnight, she said goodnight, and he said goodnight, and that was all. 2 days later, Logan Mercer violated the terms of his bail. Ramirez called Damien's legal team at 6:15 a.m. Logan had removed his monitoring device the previous evening. His last confirmed location was a gas station in the Bronx at 11:47 p.m. He had not returned to his registered address. His phone was off. Damien was in his car within 4 minutes. He called Charlotte. She answered on the second ring, which meant she'd been awake. I know, she said before he could speak. Ramirez called me too. Where are you? My apartment. Are you alone? A pause. Yes? I'm sending someone to you right now. Don't argue with me about this. A longer pause. Damien. Charlotte. The silence between them on the line had a specific texture. He was 3 blocks from her building. His security man, Torres, was 2 minutes behind him. Fine, she said, but I'm not leaving. You don't have to leave, he said. I just need eyes on the building. You sound like you've done this before, she said. Drive safe, he said, and ended the call. He pulled up outside her building and sat in the car for a moment. Torres arrived 90 seconds later, and Damien walked him through the building access points and the lobby layout and told him to post outside her floor and not to be visible from the elevator, and Torres nodded and went in. Damien sat in the car. His phone buzzed. Caruso. We have a location, Caruso said. Where? He's been watching her building since 10 p.m. last night. A pause. Damien, he's been inside the building. He accessed the service entrance. We pulled the footage. The 10-second rule. He took his 10 seconds. How long ago? He said. The footage is from 11 p.m. We don't know his current position. Damien was out of the car before Caruso finished the sentence. He was moving toward the building entrance with the focused, unhurried stride of someone who had learned long ago that running in a situation created noise, and noise created variables, and variables got people killed. He called Torres on the secondary line as he walked. He may already be in the building, he said. Service entrance. Check the stairwell on her floor. Do not engage without me. He went through the lobby, nodded at the night desk clerk without stopping, took the elevator. Stood in the elevator with his hands loose at his sides and his mind clear and precise and thinking about Charlotte Hayes alone in her apartment on the 14th floor. And a man with a monitoring device cut off his ankle somewhere in this building who had already demonstrated twice now exactly what he was capable of and exactly how much of a boundary his own destruction meant to him. The elevator opened on 14. The corridor was empty. Torres was at the far end near the stairwell door, hand raised in a specific signal that meant confirmed. Someone came through here. Damien moved down the corridor. Charlotte's apartment was the 3rd door on the left. The door was closed. He put his hand on it and felt it, and the door moved. Not open, but the latch was not fully engaged, and that was wrong. That was completely wrong, because he had stood outside this door before, and he knew how the latch sounded when it caught, and this was not that sound. He pushed the door open. The lamp in the entryway was on. Charlotte's jacket was on the hook by the door. Her keys were on the table. And from somewhere toward the back of the apartment, the kitchen, maybe, or the hallway, came a sound that turned the air in Damien Moretti's chest into something that was not quite fear, but was the closest thing to it he had felt in years. Charlotte's voice, very controlled, very flat. "Logan, put it down." And Logan Mercer's voice, stripped of everything except the thing that had always been beneath the surface of it. "You took everything from me." Damien went through the apartment without making a sound. The kitchen light was on. That was the first thing Damien registered as he moved through the apartment. The specific quality of light spilling into the hallway from the kitchen doorway, yellow and domestic and wrong, in the way that ordinary things become wrong when the context around them shifts. Charlotte's apartment was the apartment of someone who lived precisely and without excess. A couch with one throw pillow, books stacked by size on a low shelf, a desk near the window with her personal laptop closed, and a single lamp. Nothing decorative that didn't serve a purpose. He had been inside twice before, briefly, and he had noticed these things the way he noticed everything. And now he moved through the narrow hallway toward the kitchen light, with his back close to the wall and his breathing controlled and his mind running the geometry of the space ahead. Logan was in the kitchen. Charlotte was backed against the far counter with both hands flat on the surface behind her. The posture of someone who had put themselves against a fixed point and was not going to move from it without deciding to. She was in the clothes she'd been wearing when he called her. Dark trousers, a gray shirt, no jacket. Her feet were bare, which meant he'd caught her before she'd finished dressing, which meant she'd been awake but not yet ready, which meant she hadn't expected this to happen this fast. Logan was standing between her and the kitchen doorway. He had a knife, a long one, the kind that came from a wooden block on a counter, and he was holding it with the loose, unstable grip of someone who had not decided yet exactly what he intended to do with it, but had made the decision to have it. His face was the face Charlotte had described to Detective Ramirez, and that Ramirez had transcribed into a report that used words like agitated and escalating affect, but those were clinical words. And this was not a clinical situation. Logan's face was the face of a man who had dismantled everything that kept him recognizable to himself, and was standing in the rubble of it and blaming the woman across from him for the demolition. He hadn't seen Damien yet. Charlotte had. Her eyes moved to the doorway for one fraction of a second, not enough to direct Logan's attention, just enough to register. And then she looked back at Logan and kept her voice at the same controlled, flat register it had been in when Damien came through the front door. "You violated bail," she said. "You cut off the monitor. That was your choice, Logan, not mine." "You filed the report," Logan said. His voice had the tight, overloaded quality of something that had been pressurized too long. "You sent them after me. Everything. The fraud charges, the files. None of that comes out if you don't make the report that night." "You attacked me," she said. "I loved you." He said it like it was a counter-argument, like it answered something. "I have loved you for 2 years, and you treated me like I was nothing, like I was a problem to manage." "You were in my files, Logan." Her voice didn't rise. Damien noted this, the discipline of it, the way she was keeping him talking and keeping herself between him and anything he could interpret as provocation. "You had photographs, months of photographs. You had been in my apartment. I needed to understand you." His grip on the knife tightened. "You don't let anyone understand you. You keep everyone at—" He stopped. His head moved slightly, some animal alertness, and Damien stepped into the kitchen doorway. Logan spun. The knife came up and Damien was already moving. Not toward the knife, toward Logan's knife arm. The mechanics of it clean and immediate. His left hand caught Logan's wrist before the arm fully extended. His right hand came across the inside of the elbow joint, and the knife hit the kitchen floor with a sound like a period at the end of a sentence. Logan's momentum carried him sideways into the counter, and Damien had his arm up behind his back, with enough force to keep him there without enough force to break anything, and Logan made a sound that was part pain and part something more ragged and formless, and Charlotte hadn't moved from the counter across the room. "Don't," Damien said, to Logan. Quiet, completely level. Logan struggled for approximately 3 seconds and then stopped. Not because he'd made a rational decision, but because his body understood something his mind wasn't ready to. Torres was in the doorway behind Damien. Damien glanced back and nodded, and Torres came in and took Logan by both arms and walked him out of the kitchen and into the hallway, and Damien heard him on the phone to Ramirez before they reached the front door. Damien picked up the knife from the floor. He set it on the counter, blade in. He turned and looked at Charlotte. She was still against the counter. Her hands were still flat on the surface behind her. She was breathing in the specific way she breathed when her lungs were managing something. Controlled inhales, slightly longer exhales, the disciplined respiratory arithmetic of someone who had lived with the condition long enough to manage it under pressure. Her eyes were on the hallway where Torres had taken Logan. "Charlotte," he said. She looked at him. "I'm fine. You don't have to be fine right now." "I know I don't have to be." She pushed off the counter and crossed to the window above the sink and looked out at the city for a moment. "I heard him come in. I was in the bedroom and I heard the door and I had a second where I thought it was a building thing, a noise from the hallway. Then I heard his breathing." Damien said nothing. He waited. "I knew his breathing," she said. "That's the thing. I had spent 4 months listening for him and I knew the sound of it." She turned from the window. Her face was the face she wore when she was working through something and refusing to let it work through her instead. "I want him in a cell tonight." "He will be," Damien said. "Bail violation plus breaking and entering plus the knife. He's not posting bail on top of the existing charges." "There's no judge." She nodded. She was looking at him and he was looking at her. And the kitchen was very quiet now, with the city doing its thing outside and the overhead light doing its indifferent domestic thing above them. And there was something in the room that had been building for 6 weeks and that neither of them had named or moved toward. "You were already outside," she said, "when I called." "Yes." "How long?" He considered the honest answer. "Long enough." She held his gaze. "You watch over me." "I watch over a lot of things." "That's not an answer." "No," he said, "it's not." She crossed her arms over her chest, not defensively, he thought, but as if she needed something to hold on to that was her own. "What are you, Damien, actually? Because I've worked for you for 6 weeks and I've read everything publicly available about you and I understand what you are on paper. Venture capitalist, technology investor, board member. But none of that accounts for how you move through a situation. None of that accounts for tonight." He held very still. "Tonight, I came to make sure you were safe." "I know why you came. I'm asking who you are that you can." The question was precise in the way all her questions were precise. She had identified the gap in the available information, and she was asking for what filled it. He had known this moment was coming. He had known it since the night in the server room, if he was honest, and he had been managing the approach of it with the same care he managed everything that had the potential to change the shape of a situation. "Not tonight," he said quietly. She looked at him for a long moment. Something moved through her expression. Frustration, and beneath it something more considered. She was deciding whether to push. He watched her decide not to. "Okay," she said. "Soon," he said. She nodded once. "I'm not going back to sleep. I'll get dressed and come in." "You don't need to come in." "I know I don't need to." She was already moving toward the hallway. "I'll be 20 minutes. He waited in her living room. He sat on the edge of the couch and looked at the books on her shelf, and the desk near the window, and the city outside. And he thought about what soon meant, and how you told someone the truth about yourself, when the truth was the kind of thing that couldn't be untold. Logan Mercer was arrested at 2:47 a.m. Ramirez called Damien at 3:15 to confirm it. The charges were bail violation, breaking and entering, assault with a deadly weapon, and criminal menacing layered on top of the existing fraud and surveillance charges. Ramirez's voice had the particular flat satisfaction of someone who had been building something and was watching it hold. Charlotte was at her desk on the executive floor by 4 a.m. She worked. Damien worked. They didn't discuss what had happened in her kitchen, and the not discussing had a specific quality to it. Not avoidance, but a kind of mutual agreement to let the night settle before they looked at it directly. At 6 a.m., she brought him coffee without asking whether he wanted it. He took it without saying thank you, which was somehow the right register for the moment. At 7, his phone rang. Caruso. The executive floor was still empty around them, and Charlotte was in her own office, and he closed his door and took the call. "The encrypted files," Caruso said. "We finished the crack." Damien set his coffee down. "How bad?" "There are 23 women total. Charlotte's file is the largest. But Damien—" A pause. Caruso did not pause. Caruso was a man who delivered information with the uniformity of a machine, and the pause meant something. "There's a secondary file. Not surveillance. Communications. Between who? Mercer and someone inside your organization. Another pause. Inside the syndicate. The room was very still. Say that again, Damien said. There's an encrypted communications thread between Mercer and a contact identified only by a numeric handle. We trace the handle through 3 layers. It comes back to a device registered to Marco Vitelli. Damien sat with the name for 3 seconds. Marco Vitelli was 47 years old. He had been with the Moretti Syndicate for 19 years. He ran the Eastern financial operations, the legitimate side, the compliance structure, the accounting architecture that kept the empire's money clean and moving. He had been at Damien's father's funeral. He had been at the table when Damien restructured the organization a decade ago and had sat across from him and said, "I'm with you on this," and Damien had believed him because the evidence at the time supported it. "What did they discuss?" Damien said. His voice was very even. Mercer was running the skimming operation with Vitelli's infrastructure. The syndicate's shell entities, the ones Vitelli manages for the financial clean cycle, some of them were being used to route Mercer's fraud proceeds. Vitelli gets a cut. Has been for 2.5 years. 2.5 years? Damien looked at the wall of his office and recalibrated every conversation he had with Marco Vitelli in the last 2.5 years against this new information and felt the particular cold, nauseating quality of a foundation you had trusted turning out to have been compromised the whole time. "There's more," Caruso said. "Tell me." "The night you went to the server room, the emergency alert from Charlotte's phone, it came through the building's security system. Standard protocol is for the security desk to notify the duty officer. The duty officer that night was one of Vitelli's people. He should have been the first to respond." A pause. He sat on the alert for 11 minutes before forwarding it. 11 minutes. Damien's hand on the phone was completely still. "If you hadn't been in the building yourself," Caruso said, and then stopped, because the sentence didn't need finishing. Damien understood what the sentence meant. If he had been anywhere else that night, in his car, at home, at the restaurant 3 blocks away where he sometimes ate late, the 11-minute delay would have been long enough. "Vitelli knew about Mercer," Damien said. "The communications suggest he helped Mercer identify Charlotte specifically. Mercer had been watching several women. Vitelli steered him toward Charlotte because Charlotte had found a discrepancy in a vendor invoice 2 months before the server room incident. She flagged it to her direct supervisor, who killed it before it reached you. But Vitelli knew she'd found it. He was worried she'd find the rest. Charlotte Hayes had nearly died in a server room because she was good at her job and the wrong person had noticed." Damien set the phone down on his desk without ending the call. He sat with both hands flat on the desk surface and breathed through what he was feeling, which was something he had significant practice doing and which was significantly more difficult than usual. He had a decision to make. He had several decisions to make, and they were the kind that could not be undone and that would determine the shape of multiple things going forward. Marco Vitelli had been at the table for 19 years. He knew things. He knew the full architecture of the clean cycle. He knew names and accounts and routing structures that did not exist in written form anywhere. He was also the man who had sat across from Damien a decade ago and said, "I'm with you on this." And Damien had built the next 10 years of the organization's restructured foundation on the assumption that this was true. It was not true. It had never been true. He picked the phone back up. "Put Vitelli under full surveillance. Nothing moves. I want eyes on his communications, his accounts, his location. He doesn't know we have the files." "Confirmed," Caruso said. "What do you want to do about Charlotte?" Damien looked at the glass partition of his office. Charlotte's office was 2 doors down. He could see the light under her door. "Nothing yet," he said. "She doesn't know about the syndicate connection." "No. If Vitelli finds out we have the files before you move on him, she becomes a liability he might try to eliminate." The word landed with the weight Caruso intended it to have. Damien processed it. "Double the security on her floor," he said, quietly. "I want someone on the building entrance around the clock, and I want it done before 8 a.m. Done." He ended the call and sat in his office and thought about Charlotte Hayes 2 doors away, working at 4 in the morning because she refused to let a man with a knife determine how her night ended. And he thought about Vitelli's name in those files, and he thought about what soon meant now that it meant something different than it had 3 hours ago. He needed to tell her, not Everything. Not yet, and maybe not in the form he had imagined because the form had just changed. But she had asked him who he was, and he had said not tonight. And now the situation had shifted in a direction that meant she was operating without information she needed to be safe. That was a liability he had created by waiting, and one he was going to have to correct. He stood up. He went to her office and knocked twice and opened the door. She looked up from her screen. She read his face in the way she read everything. Fast, thorough, not missing the edges. "What happened?" she said. Not a question. He came in and closed the door behind him and sat across from her desk. He looked at her for a moment. She waited. "I told you I'd explain," he said, "who I am, what I actually run." Something shifted in her expression. Careful. Attentive. "Okay, what I'm going to tell you doesn't leave this room," he said. "Not because I'm asking you to protect me. Because what I'm about to tell you connects directly to what happened tonight and to Logan Mercer and to why you've been in danger from the beginning. And before I tell you the rest of it, I need you to understand the full context." She had gone very still. Not tense, still. The stillness of someone who understood they were about to receive information that would reorganize something fundamental. "I run Blackridge Technologies," he said, "and I run something else, something older, something that operates underneath the legitimate structure." He held her gaze. "My family built an organization 40 years ago that is not visible in any public record. I inherited it. I have spent the last decade restructuring it, its purpose, its methods, its reach. But it exists. It is real. And it is how I knew what Logan Mercer was before the police did." Charlotte did not move. "It's also," he said, "how I know that someone inside that organization was connected to Mercer. That this connection was operational before the night in the server room. That Logan's access to you was not random." He paused. "Someone used Logan Mercer as a tool to neutralize you because you were close to finding something they didn't want found." The silence in the room was complete. Charlotte's eyes were on his face, and they were doing the thing they always did, reading, assessing, separating the signal from the noise with the rapid, relentless accuracy that had made her the best technical mind in the building, and that now, in this context, was going to bring her to a conclusion he was not sure she was ready for. "The fraud," she said slowly. "The vendor discrepancy I flagged 2 months before the server room. My supervisor killed it." "Your supervisor didn't kill it," Damien said. "He passed it to someone who did." She absorbed this. He watched her absorb it. He watched the sequence of it move across her face, my understanding, and then the specific horror of understanding, and then something harder and colder that settled into her eyes like something locking into place. "I was targeted," she said. "Not because of Logan. Logan was a mechanism," Damien said. "Yes." "Someone in your organization pointed him at me." "Yes." She sat with this for a long moment. He let her sit with it. Outside the office, the building was beginning its early morning shift change. Distant sounds of the elevator, the faint movement of the floor coming back to life. "Who?" she said. He told her the name. Charlotte Hayes looked at him across the desk, and he watched something happen to her face that he had not seen before. Not fear, not anger in the form he'd seen it. Something more fundamental. The expression of a person who has just understood that the ground they thought they were standing on had never been what it appeared, and that the fall had already started, and that the only question now was what they were going to do on the way down. She stood up from her desk. She walked to the window. She stood with her back to him and her arms crossed, and she looked at the city coming awake below them, and she was very quiet for a very long time. Then she said, without turning around, "He's still inside your organization." "Yes," Damien said. "He knows where I am every day." "Yes." She turned. Her face was completely composed now in a way that was different from her usual composure, stripped of everything that wasn't absolutely necessary, like a structure that has shed everything non-load-bearing. "Then we have a problem," she said, "because if he finds out you've told me and I'm still here, I become a variable he needs to eliminate before your move on him." "I know," Damien said. "And if I leave, he knows something changed." "I know that too." She looked at him. He looked at her. The city outside was turning gray at the edges with early light, and somewhere in the building below them, a man who had sat at Damien's table for 19 years was arriving for another day's work. unaware that the architecture of his arrangement had just been exposed. And Charlotte Hayes was standing in an office 2 doors from Damian Moretti's and working out the geometry of her own position with the same focused precision she brought to every problem she had ever been given, except that this one had her name on it in a file she had never been meant to. The plan took 4 hours to build and 30 seconds to fall apart. Damian laid it out on the conference room table at 7 a.m. with Caruso on a secured line, and Torres in the room and Charlotte sitting across from him with a legal pad and a pen she hadn't used yet because she was holding it in both hands like something to anchor her to the surface of the table. The plan was clean. Move on Vitelli simultaneously on 3 fronts: financial seizure through the syndicate's internal compliance authority, criminal referral to the federal task force already working the Mercer case, and a controlled extraction of the syndicate's routing infrastructure from Vitelli's access before he understood what was happening. Timed correctly, he would have no warning and no exit. The variable they hadn't accounted for was Richard Hale. Hale was Blackridge's general counsel. 52 years old, 22 years with the company, the kind of institutional fixture that accumulated so much organizational knowledge, he became structurally difficult to remove regardless of loyalty. He had been Vitelli's connection point inside the legitimate corporate structure, not a syndicate member, not read into the full operation, but useful in the specific way that men who process legal paperwork without asking questions about its origins are useful. He had been managing the document flow between Vitelli's shell entities and Blackridge's vendor accounts for 18 months, and he did not know the full shape of what he was part of. What he did know, at 7:43 a.m., was that Charlotte Hayes had been in an early meeting with Damian Moretti and 2 unidentified individuals on a day when the executive floor was supposed to be running a routine schedule. He knew this because he walked past the conference room glass and looked in and saw Charlotte's face, the specific, focused, stripped-down expression she had been wearing since 4 a.m., and made a phone call 20 minutes later that Caruso intercepted and flagged at 8:09. Hale had called Vitelli. He hadn't said much. He hadn't needed to. 2 sentences. Something's happening on the executive floor. Charlotte Hayes is involved. That was enough. Caruso's voice on the secured line was flat and fast. Vitelli's moving. He's accessed the routing infrastructure remotely. He's trying to initiate a transfer out of the primary clean accounts. If he gets the full transfer through, we lose the financial evidence and he has enough liquid to disappear. Damian was on his feet. How long? Transfer window is 12 minutes. After that, the funds are in accounts we can't touch. 12 minutes. Damian looked at Torres. Torres was already moving. Lock Hale in his office, Damian said. Don't hurt him. Lock the door and take his phone. Torres went. Damian looked at Charlotte. She had stood up and she was looking at him with the clear, unhurried eyes of someone who had already processed the new information and was waiting for instruction or was about to give some. He couldn't always tell which with her, and this was one of those moments. The routing infrastructure, she said. Vitelli's accessing it remotely. Where does it run through? Blackridge servers, Damian said. Specifically, the secondary financial compliance node on 38, she said. I passed through the server architecture 6 weeks ago when I was building the vendor audit framework. I know that system. She was already picking up her laptop. If I can get into the compliance node, I can freeze the transfer from the inside. It'll look like an automated security flag. Vitelli won't know it's been manually initiated. Damian looked at her. That takes you off this floor. I know. If Vitelli has anyone in the building, then Torres comes with me, she said. You deal with Vitelli, I deal with the transfer. We have 11 minutes. He wanted to tell her no. He understood the precise shape of why no was the correct operational answer. She was a civilian, the building's security integrity was uncertain. Vitelli's response to Hale's call was unknown in its full scope. Every variable pointed toward keeping her stationary and protected. She was also right that she was the only person in the building who knew the compliance node architecture well enough to freeze the transfer manually in under 10 minutes. Torres goes with you, he said. You do not separate from him for any reason. You do not open any door he hasn't cleared first. Understood. Charlotte? She was turning toward the door. She stopped. He held her gaze for 1 second. Come back. Something moved across her face. Not the professional composure, not the stripped-down operational expression. Something underneath both of those. Working on it, she said. She went. Damian called Caruso. Where's Vitelli physically? His car is in the parking structure on the second level. He hasn't come up. He's running the transfer from his phone. Who does he have in the building? We're not sure. Hale is confirmed. There may be one more. A security contractor who came on shift at 6 a.m. Name doesn't match any of our cleared personnel. We're trying to locate him now. An unknown contractor on the floor. Damien moved out of the conference room and into the main corridor, heading for the elevator bank. He had his phone in his left hand and his right hand loose at his side, and he was thinking about the building layout and the parking structure, and Marco Vitelli sitting in a car 2 levels below street level running a 12-minute financial extraction on a phone. And he was thinking about 19 years, and about a man who had said, "I'm with you on this," and had been calculating his exit from the moment he said it. The elevator took 45 seconds. He counted them. The parking structure was accessed from the lobby through a secured door that required executive badge clearance. He went through it and took the stairs down 2 levels because the elevator shaft in the structure was a confinement risk, and he did not do confinement risks when the variables were unresolved. Level 2 was low-ceilinged and badly lit, the concrete columns casting regular shadows between rows of vehicles. He came through the stairwell door and oriented himself. Vitelli's car was a black sedan, registered to one of his legitimate entities, usually parked in the same spot near the eastern column row, because men like Vitelli were creatures of habit, even when they were dismantling everything. He found the car. Vitelli was inside it. Damien could see him through the driver's window, the phone in both hands, his face tilted down toward the screen, the tense forward posture of someone watching a progress bar and willing it to move faster. Vitelli was a compact man, gray at the temples, with the permanently careful expression of someone who had spent 2 decades managing the intersection of legal and illegal money, and knew that carefulness was the only thing that kept you on the right side of a very particular kind of ending. He looked up when Damien's hand hit the door. Damien didn't open it. He stood outside the glass and looked at Vitelli, and Vitelli looked back at him, and for a moment neither of them moved. Then Vitelli's hand went back to his phone. Damien opened the door. He did it with enough force that it swung wide, and Vitelli's hand came up reflexively, and Damien took the phone in one clean motion. Not a grab, a controlled removal, the way you take something from someone when you've already calculated that they won't be fast enough to stop you. He stepped back from the car with the phone in his hand and looked at the screen. The transfer was at 63%. He ended the session. Vitelli got out of the car slowly. He was wearing his jacket and his tie, and he had the look of a man who was doing rapid internal calculation and had not yet landed on his best available position. His hands were at his sides. He was looking at Damien with the specific focused wariness of someone who had known this man for 19 years and was now trying to read how much he knew. "Damien," he said. "Marco." Damien's voice was completely even. He held the phone loosely in one hand. The transfers stopped. Vitelli said nothing. "The files are in federal custody," Damien said. "The communications thread between you and Mercer, the routing architecture, the syndicate accounts you used for his fraud proceeds." He watched Vitelli's face. 2.5 years, Marco." Vitelli's jaw moved. Something behind his eyes went from calculating to something older and less managed. "You don't understand what the restructure cost," he said. "What it cost people who had been in this organization their whole lives. You came in and you changed the terms and you expected everyone to just—" "I expected the people who told me they were with me to be with me," Damien said. "That was the whole of it." "You gutted the operation," Vitelli said, louder now, the careful surface cracking. "You made us legitimate. You know what legitimate means for men like us? It means smaller. It means less. It means watching everything we built get handed to lawyers and accountants." His voice was hard and ragged at the edges. "I built things in this organization before you were running it." "I know what you built," Damien said. "I also know what you did with Logan Mercer. I know you put him on Charlotte Hayes because she was about to find your accounts in the vendor audit. She was a problem. She was an employee doing her job. She was going to pull the thread, and the whole thing was going to—" Vitelli stopped. He looked at Damien. Something in his expression shifted. The anger receding slightly, replaced by something more calculated, more dangerous in the specific way that men are dangerous when they have decided they have nothing left to manage. "What are you going to do, Damien? Hand me to the feds?" Everything I know about this organization goes with me into testimony. You understand that. Everything. The word hung between them in the low-lit concrete air of the parking structure. Damien looked at him. I know what you know, he said. I built what you know. I can manage what you know going to the feds because I have spent 10 years restructuring this organization precisely so that a conversation like this one would not be fatal to it. He paused. You should have considered that before you decided to betray me. Vitelli's face went through something complicated and fast. He had expected the threat of exposure to land harder. He had been banking on it, Damien understood, banking on the idea that the syndicate's vulnerability to federal scrutiny was his leverage. He had not fully accounted for the decade of restructuring and the legal architecture and the compliance framework and the specific, deliberate work Damien had done to ensure that the legitimate face of the operation could withstand exactly this kind of pressure. The calculation had failed. Vitelli could see it failing in real time. His hand moved. Damien didn't see where the gun came from. A jacket holster, probably, or the waistband at his back. What he saw was the motion, and he was already moving when the motion started because he had been watching Vitelli's right shoulder for the last 40 seconds, and the shoulder had telegraphed it 6 seconds before the hand moved. He got inside the arm before the weapon was fully raised, and they were against the side of the car, and the gun was pointing at the concrete ceiling, and Damien's left hand had Vitelli's gun hand locked, and his right forearm was across Vitelli's chest, and his weight was driving backward into the car door. The gun went off. Concrete somewhere above them. The sound of it in the low-ceilinged structure was enormous and flat, and Damien felt it in his back teeth. Vitelli was strong. Not as strong as he'd been 10 years ago, but strong enough. And he was fighting with the complete commitment of someone who had moved past options into the single available direction. His free hand came up and caught Damien across the side of the face, and Damien's vision went briefly white at the edges, and he tasted copper and lost an inch on the gun arm. He didn't lose the gun arm. He drove his knee into the inside of Vitelli's thigh. Not the groin, the thigh. A specific nerve cluster, the kind of targeting that came from being taught to end confrontations by someone who had learned in rooms without rules. Vitelli's leg buckled. His grip on the gun went loose for 1 second, and Damien took the weapon with both hands, stepped back, and pointed it at the ground between them. Vitelli slid down the side of the car to one knee. He was breathing hard. His face was flushed, and his tie was sideways, and he was looking up at Damien with an expression that had nothing calculated left in it, just something exhausted and old, and finally, completely exposed. "It's done, Marco," Damien said. He was breathing harder than he wanted to be. His face hurt where Vitelli had caught him, and he could feel the blood starting at the corner of his mouth. "It's done." Vitelli looked at the ground. His hands were flat on the concrete. He didn't move. Damien's phone went off. He kept the weapon directed at the ground and answered it with his left hand. It was Charlotte. Her voice was fast and tight, and she was breathing harder than usual. "Transfer is frozen. I flagged it as an automated security event. Vitelli won't know it was manually initiated unless someone tells him." A pause. "Are you okay?" "I heard a shot." "I'm okay," he said. "Vitelli is contained." A silence. "The unknown contractor. Torres found him on 26. He was heading for my floor." Another pause, and her voice had something in it he hadn't heard before. Not fear, but the aftermath of it, the specific quality of adrenaline on its way down. "Torres handled it." "Are you hurt?" "No." A beat. "Are you actually okay, or are you telling me you're okay?" He looked at the blood on his hand from touching the corner of his mouth. "I'm functional," he said, and heard something move through the silence on her end that might have been a breath of relief or might have been something else. "I'll be down in 4 minutes, she said. "Charlotte, 4 minutes, she said, and ended the call. He stood in the parking structure with Marco Vitelli on the ground, and a gun he wasn't going to use and the taste of blood in his mouth, and he thought about 19 years and what you did with a betrayal that had been structural from the beginning. He thought about the compliance framework, and the federal task force, and Detective Ramirez, and the case that was already built, and that Vitelli's communications with Mercer would now extend and strengthen. He thought about what Vitelli had said. "Everything I know goes with me into testimony." And he thought about the 10 years of work that made that threat manageable, and he thought about the specific, peculiar grace of having done a thing correctly before you needed it to be correct. He heard footsteps on the stairwell. The door opened. Charlotte came through it with Torres 3 steps behind her. She was moving fast, and she slowed when she saw the scene. Vitelli on the ground, Damien standing, the gun pointed down, the blood on Damien's face. And she stopped and took it in with the rapid assessment she brought to everything, and her expression did a complicated sequence of things that she didn't fully manage to contain. She crossed to him. She stopped 2 feet away and looked at his face, and then looked at him. At his eyes, specifically, the way she always looked when she was checking whether what she was being told matched what she was seeing. "You said you were okay." "I said I was functional." "That's not the same thing." She reached up and he held still while her fingers touched the side of his face briefly. Clinical, he told himself. Assessment, the way she touched everything she was trying to understand. Her hand came back with a small trace of red on the fingertips. She looked at it. "It's surface," he said. "I know it's surface." She looked up at him. They were close enough that he could see the specific exhaustion behind her controlled expression. The 4 a.m. and the server room 6 weeks ago, and Logan's knife in her kitchen, and the compliance note on 38, and everything the morning had been, layered into the set of her jaw and the slight tension around her eyes. "I need you to tell me when you're not okay," she said. "Not because I need to manage it, because I need accurate information." He looked at her. This parking structure was very quiet now. Vitelli hadn't moved. "Okay," he said. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she stepped back and looked at Vitelli on the ground, and something hardened in her expression. Not cruelty, but the specific settled quality of someone who had been looking at the full shape of a thing for the first time and was now done looking and ready to act. "The federal task force has the files," she said. "The communications thread, the routing architecture, the transfer attempt. That's enough." She looked at Damien. "Call Ramirez." He called Ramirez. The detective answered on the first ring, and Damien gave him the parking structure address and the summary, and Ramirez said, "I'll have agents there in 8 minutes, and don't let him move." And Damien said, "Understood. 8 minutes." He ended the call and stood in the low concrete light of the parking structure with Charlotte Hayes beside him, and Marco Vitelli on the ground, and the gun still in his hand, and he became aware of something that he had been aware of in pieces for 6 weeks, but that was now assembled into a single coherent thing, an awareness of her, specific and complete, that had nothing to do with the situation and everything to do with the person. She was standing with her arms loose at her sides, and her chin level, and her eyes forward, and she was the most precisely competent human being he had encountered in a professional context in 20 years of working in environments where competence was the minimum requirement for survival. She had frozen a financial transfer from a compliance node under operational pressure while an unknown hostile was moving toward her floor. She had called him to confirm his status before confirming her own. She had touched his face with the same analytical precision she brought to contract language and server architecture and the geometry of a room's exits. He looked at her. She looked at him. "After this," he said. She didn't ask what he meant. "After this," she said. The federal agents arrived in 7 minutes and 40 seconds. 2 vehicles, 4 agents, Ramirez behind them with his notepad and his flat, competent eyes. They moved through the parking structure with the organized efficiency of people who had been briefed in transit, and Ramirez looked at Vitelli on the ground, and then at the gun in Damien's hand, and then at the blood on Damien's face, and said, "Give me the short version," and Damien gave it to him in 90 seconds. Ramirez listened. He wrote 3 things down. He looked at Charlotte. "You froze the transfer." "Yes," she said. "I can walk your forensics team through the compliance node access logs. Everything is documented. The transfer initiation, the session data, the routing paths. It connects directly to the communications thread in the encrypted files." Ramirez wrote something else down. "I'm going to need a full statement." "You'll have it today," she said. They took Vitelli. He went without fighting, which was its own kind of information. The fight had gone out of him somewhere between the gun and the concrete, and what was left was a man who had made 25 years of careful calculations and had finally calculated wrong. He didn't look at Damien as they walked him past. Damien watched him go and felt something that was not satisfaction, but was the specific flatness of a thing resolved. Ramirez paused beside Damien before he followed his team. "Mercer's arraignment is tomorrow morning," he said. "With the new charges from last night and the Vitelli connection, the DA is pushing for remand. No bail." "Good," Damien said. Ms. Hayes will be called as a primary witness, probably multiple times. He glanced at her. She up for that? Ask her, Damien said. Ramirez looked at Charlotte. She looked back at him. I've been up for it since the server room, she said. Ramirez almost smiled. He went after his team. The parking structure was empty now, except for the two of them and Torres standing at a discreet distance near the stairwell door. The fluorescent light above them was buzzing slightly. A faulty ballast, the kind of small, persistent malfunction that buildings accumulate. Damien became aware of it now that the structure was quiet, the way you notice ambient sound after a loud event stops. He looked at Charlotte. She was looking at the space where Vitelli had been. Her expression was doing something he hadn't seen before, processing, but not the rapid analytical processing she usually did. Something slower, something that was moving through the full weight of the morning and settling. You've known for 6 weeks, she said, that the fraud was connected to your organization. I found out this morning, he said, the full connection. I suspected the leak was internal before that. I didn't know it reached Vitelli. But you knew there was a leak. Yes. She looked at him. And you kept me close because of it. I kept you close, he said, for several reasons. The leak was one of them. She held his gaze. What were the others? He looked at her in the buzzing fluorescent light of a parking structure on a morning that had started at 4 a.m. and had included a knife and a gun and a federal arrest, and he thought about what it meant to be precise with someone who valued precision above almost everything else. You know what the others were, he said. Something moved through her expression. Not surprise. Something more like confirmation. The specific quality of someone who has been sitting with a hypothesis and has just received the data point that settles it. She looked at him for a long moment, and he looked back at her, and the distance between them was 2 feet, and had been 2 feet for 6 weeks, and was now a different kind of 2 feet than it had been before. Damien, she said. Charlotte. You have blood on your face, and we're in a parking structure, and there are about 700 things that need to happen in the next 4 hours. She paused. So you should know that I am fully aware of what you just said and what it means, and I am choosing to deal with it after the 700 things. That's a reasonable position, he said, but I'm going to deal with it, she said, after. I know, he said. She turned toward the stairwell. Torres fell in beside her and Damien followed, and they went back up into the building and into the morning that was waiting for them. And in 4 hours and 20 minutes, Charlotte Hayes sat across from 2 federal prosecutors in a conference room on the 41st floor and delivered a complete, documented, technically precise account of everything she had found, everything she had done, and everything she had witnessed. And the prosecutors looked at each other when she finished, and one of them said, "This is the cleanest evidentiary presentation I've received from a civilian witness in 11 years. Charlotte said nothing to that. She asked if they needed anything else. They needed 3 more hours. She gave it to them. At 6:30 p.m., she walked out of the conference room and down the corridor to her office and sat down in her chair and put her head back and closed her eyes. Damien was in the doorway 30 seconds later. He leaned against the frame and looked at her, and she looked at him from under barely open eyes and said nothing. It's done, he said, meaning the day, meaning the 700 things. Almost, she said, meaning what was left.
You met?
He came into the office and closed the door, and the city outside the window was doing its early evening thing, the light going amber, the traffic shifting registers, the distant sound of the world continuing its business with the complete indifference it always had. And Marco Vitelli was in federal custody, and Logan Mercer was going to arraignment in the morning, and Charlotte Hayes had given 3 hours of testimony that was going to help build a federal case against both of them. And Damien Moretti was standing in her office with dried blood on the corner of his mouth, and his jacket undone, and looking at her like she was the only fixed point in the room. She stood up. She was in front of him, and she put one hand flat against his chest. Not pushing, just placing, the same analytical touch she'd used on his face in the parking structure. Except that this time her eyes came up to his at the same time, and there was nothing analytical about what was in them. You said soon, she said. 6 weeks ago, when I asked who you were. I told you this morning. You told me part of it. Her hand was still on his chest. The rest of it. He put his hand over hers, not moving it, just covering it with the weight and warmth of his own. The rest of it takes longer than tonight, he said. I know, she said. I'm not going anywhere. Outside, the city went amber and then dark. And inside the office, the light stayed on. And in a federal holding facility across the borough, Marco Vitelli sat in a cell and thought about 19 years. And in a hospital 2 miles north, Logan Mercer's public defender was preparing for an arraignment that was going to go the way Charlotte Hayes had been waiting 11 months for it to go. And Damian Moretti stood in an office on the 41st floor of Blackridge Technologies, with Charlotte Hayes' hand under his, and the long, specific work of telling the whole truth finally, irrevocably. The truth took 3 nights. Not because Damian was reluctant, exactly, but because the truth about what he was had layers that couldn't be compressed into a single conversation without becoming something thinner and less honest than the thing itself. He had spent 10 years building a version of himself that could exist in daylight, and the full accounting of everything beneath that version required the kind of time and care that couldn't be rushed without breaking something. The first night was in his office. Late. The floor empty. He told her about his father, not the biographical sketch he'd offered in the conference room weeks ago, but the actual version. Aldo Moretti, who had built the syndicate from a protection operation in Lower Manhattan into a multi-borough intelligence and financial network over 30 years, through methods that were exactly what you would expect from a man of that era and that world, who had died of a stroke at 61 with blood on his hands that no amount of legitimate business had ever washed off, and who had not, as far as Damian could tell, lost a night's sleep over it. Damian had been 32 when he inherited it. He had stood in the office his father built and looked at what he was being handed and had understood that he had 2 choices: continue it as it was, or spend the next decade dismantling and rebuilding it into something he could look at in the morning. He had chosen the second option, not because he was a good man in any clean sense, but because he was a precise man, and precision required that the thing he ran matched the thing he was willing to be. Charlotte listened through all of it without interrupting. She asked 3 questions, all of them specific and technical, about the restructuring, about what the legitimate face actually covered, and what it didn't, about whether the violence was historical or operational. He answered all 3 without hedging. When he finished, she was quiet for a while. "You're telling me this now," she said, "because of Vitelli. Because if you'd told me before, the information was a liability, and now the case is built, and the liability calculus has changed." "Partly," he said. "What's the other part?" "I told you in the parking structure," he said. "You said you'd deal with it after." She looked at him. "I'm dealing with it." "I know," he said. "That's why I'm telling you." She was quiet again. He watched her process it the way she processed everything, thoroughly, without performing ease, without managing her own reaction for his benefit. He found this quality in her, which most people would have called cold, to be the opposite of cold. It was the quality of someone who respected a thing enough to actually look at it. "I'm not going to pretend this is simple," she said. "I'm not asking you to. I'm going to need time with it." "Take it," he said. She did. She took 4 days during which she worked with her usual precision and said nothing personal to him, and he gave her the space she'd asked for without filling it with reassurance or pressure, because she had not asked for either of those things, and he was trying to give her what she actually asked for rather than what his own discomfort suggested. On the 5th day, she came to his office at 7 in the morning before the floor populated and sat across from him and said, "I grew up watching my mother work 2 jobs to keep us from losing an apartment. I know what it means to operate in a world that doesn't give you clean options. I'm not saying that's equivalent to what you run. I'm saying I understand the architecture of survival better than you might think." He looked at her. He said nothing because nothing was what the moment required. "I'm also saying," she continued, "that if you lie to me about anything ever, I will walk out of this building and you will not find me." She held his gaze. "I need that to be the agreement." "It's the agreement," he said. "Then we're okay," she said. She stood up. "The Kellerman integration report is on your desk. There's an issue with the data classification protocol on the legacy servers that I need your sign-off to resolve." She walked out. He sat for a moment. Then he reached for the Kellerman report. The trial of Logan Mercer began 11 weeks after his arraignment and lasted 19 days. Charlotte was called to testify on the 4th day. She wore a dark blazer and sat in the witness chair with the same level, unhurried posture she brought to board presentations, and she described every event in chronological sequence: the 4 months of observed behavior, The server room, the hospital, the bail violation, the knife in her kitchen, with the precise, unembellished language of someone who understood that clarity was more devastating than drama. The prosecutor let her talk. The defense tried 3 times to rattle her and failed each time, because rattling Charlotte Hayes required something the defense attorney didn't have, which was a question she hadn't already considered. Damien was not in the courtroom that day. He had learned early that his presence at anything involving Charlotte in a public context created variables he couldn't fully control, because the people who knew what he was would read his presence as a signal, and the people who didn't know what he was would eventually wonder why the CEO of Blackridge Technologies was sitting in a criminal trial for an ex-employee. He stayed away and received a text from Ramirez at 3:47 p.m. She was exceptional. Defense has nothing. He read it twice and put his phone face down on his desk and went back to work. 15 other women testified over the following 2 weeks. They came from different cities, different industries, different decades of Logan Mercer's life, and what they described collectively was a pattern so consistent and so long-standing that the courtroom by the end of it had the particular dense, airless quality of a space where something true and terrible has been fully exposed to the light. Charlotte watched their testimony from the gallery on the days she wasn't working. She sat straight-backed and listened to each woman and did not perform visible emotion, which was its own kind of witness. She told Damien about one of them, a woman named Sandra, who had encountered Mercer 8 years earlier, who had filed a report that went nowhere, who had spent 8 years carrying what Charlotte called the specific exhaustion of not being believed. Charlotte said this in his office at the end of a long day, and her voice was flat and precise, but her hands were doing something she didn't usually allow them to do, which was holding each other too tightly in her lap. He moved from behind his desk. He sat beside her on the low chairs near the window and didn't say anything, and didn't touch her, just occupied the adjacent space with the patient steadiness of someone who had learned that presence could be a form of language. After a while, she said, "She came up to me after, Sandra. She said thank you." "You earned it," he said. "I didn't do it for her," Charlotte said. "I didn't even know she existed." "Doesn't change what it means to her," he said. She was quiet. Outside the window, the city was doing its evening thing. She looked at it for a while. "I'm going to start something," she said, "after this is over. A program. Kids who grew up the way I did, no resources, no access, teaching them cybersecurity, systems architecture, the actual skills. Not theory." She paused. "There's a pipeline problem, and it starts at age 12, and nobody with actual access to industry is addressing it at the source." He looked at her. "Tell me what you need," he said. She glanced at him sideways. "Don't make it a Blackridge initiative. It needs to be independent. If it is a corporate program, it becomes PR." "I know," he said. "Tell me what you need as a private matter." She looked at him for a moment. "Seed funding, access to facilities, and someone who knows how to structure a nonprofit without it becoming a vehicle for someone else's tax planning." "I know someone," he said. "Of course you do," she said, and something almost like lightness moved through her voice. Not humor exactly, but the specific quality of a person who has been through enough to earn the right to irony. Logan Mercer was convicted on all 14 counts on a Tuesday afternoon in late October. The jury took 4 hours. The judge delivered a sentencing recommendation 3 weeks later: 43 years in federal prison, no parole eligibility for the first 30. The financial fraud charges alone would have carried significant time. The surveillance charges, the assault charges, the bail violations, the evidence of a pattern extending back over a decade, the sentencing was the mathematical sum of a life spent doing specific, deliberate harm to specific, deliberate people, and the math was correct. Charlotte was in the courthouse when the verdict was read. She was sitting in the 4th row with Priya beside her and Detective Ramirez 1 row back. And when the foreperson said guilty on the first count, she did not move. She sat through all 14 counts with her hands flat on her thighs and her eyes forward, and when it was done, she stood up, and she and Priya walked out into the October air on the courthouse steps, and she stood there for a minute with the city moving past and her breath making small clouds in the cold. Priya didn't say anything. She was, Charlotte had told Damien once, the best kind of friend. The kind who knew when silence was the thing. Damien was parked half a block from the courthouse. He didn't go in, and he didn't call. He waited, because he had learned in the months since the parking structure that Charlotte Hayes moved through things at her own pace, and that the most useful thing he could do in those moments was be available without being present in a way that managed her experience for her. She called him 40 minutes after the verdict. She said, "It's done." Her voice was steady and clean and had something in it he hadn't heard before, but not relief exactly. Something older than relief. The specific quality of a weight that has been carried so long that its absence takes a moment to register physically. "I know," he said. "Are you okay?" "Yes," she said. And this time, unlike every other time she'd said it in the past year, he believed her without qualification. "Come get me," she said. "I want to go somewhere that isn't the courthouse and isn't the office." He drove her to a restaurant in Brooklyn that he had been going to for 20 years. Small, corner location. The kind of place that didn't take reservations and didn't need to because the regulars made it work on their own internal schedule. They ate, and they talked about things that were not the trial and not the syndicate and not Blackridge, which was a register of conversation they had been slowly building toward for months, and which now felt, for the first time, like the natural one. He told her about a house upstate that his father had bought before he was born, and that had sat empty for most of his adult life because he'd never had a reason to use it. She told him about the first time she'd ever driven out of Baltimore as a teenager, a school trip to Washington, and how she'd looked at the buildings and thought, "Those are made by people like me, and people like me could make them." They were the last people in the restaurant. The staff were stacking chairs around them with the patient, practiced tolerance of people accustomed to tables that didn't want to leave. Damien paid. They walked out into the October night. She took his arm without preface, just put her hand through the crook of his elbow and kept walking, like it was something they'd been doing for years. He matched her pace and said nothing, and they walked 2 blocks in the cold before she said, "I want to see the house upstate." "It needs work," he said. "I know," she said. "I want to see it anyway." He looked at her in the orange light of a street lamp. She looked back at him, and her expression was the expression she had when she'd made a decision and was not reconsidering it. He thought about the first time he'd seen that expression, in a conference room 6 months ago when she told him she would take the position on a trial basis, and he thought about everything between that moment and this one, and the specific shape of what it made. "All right," he said, "this weekend." The weekend came. The house was 2 hours north of the city, set back from a road that ran through open country with the Hudson Valley laid out on one side in the particular November color of things letting go, brown and amber, and the last of a season finishing its work. The house itself was substantial and neglected, a stone and timber structure from the 1940s that had good bones and deferred maintenance and the specific melancholy of spaces that were built for inhabitation and have been waiting for it. Charlotte walked through every room. She took her time. She opened closets and ran her hand along windowsills and stood in the kitchen for a while looking at the view of the field behind the house where the grass had gone winter pale and a tree line stood at the far edge like a held breath. "You could work here," she said. "Some things," he said. "Not everything." "No," she agreed. "Not everything." She turned from the window. She was in a coat and her hair was down, which he had rarely seen, and she looked like herself in a way that was slightly different from the office version. Less armored, not because the armor was gone, but because she'd chosen to leave it in the car. "But some things," he said. They stayed 2 nights. The second evening they sat on the back porch in the cold with blankets, and the kind of silence that doesn't need to be filled, and she asked him something she'd been building toward for a while. "Marco Vitelli," she said. "He said the restructure cost people." "It did," Damien said. "Did you know that when you did it?" "Yes." "And you did it anyway?" "Yes." He held the word without adding to it for a moment. "The organization my father built ran on harm. Direct harm to people who didn't choose to be in proximity to it. I couldn't justify running it that way. The cost of changing it was real. Some people left. Some people resented it. Vitelli apparently spent 10 years planning his exit through me." He paused. "I would make the same decision again." She looked at him. "Even knowing about Vitelli, especially knowing about Vitelli," he said, "because the alternative is being the kind of organization that produces Vitellis as a feature rather than a failure." She was quiet for a moment. The field was dark and the tree line was dark, and above them the sky was doing the thing it did upstate, which was being enormous and full of the kind of light that the city swallowed whole. "My father would have liked you," she said. He respected people who made hard calls and then stood in them. He said nothing. She hadn't talked about her father since the early weeks, and he understood that the sentence was not a casual one. She tucked her chin into the blanket. He was a construction worker. He fell on a site that hadn't been properly maintained. The company's insurance lawyers spent 14 months making sure my mother got as little as possible. A pause. I've been fighting institutions with hidden structures ever since. I just didn't always know that was what I was doing. You know it now, he said. I know it now, she agreed. They drove back to the city on Sunday evening, and the following Monday, Charlotte filed the incorporation documents for what would become the Hayes Foundation, a nonprofit technology education program targeting underserved youth aged 10 to 18, with a focus on cybersecurity, systems architecture, and applied engineering. Damien's private attorney handled the legal structure. The seed funding came from Damien's personal accounts and from two other sources Charlotte had cultivated herself: a former Blackridge board member and a technology foundation that had been looking for exactly this kind of program for 2 years. She ran the first workshop herself in February in a community center in the South Bronx, 16 kids between 11 and 15, 3 hours on a Saturday morning covering basic network principles through a project that involved building a simple home security system from components they could buy for under $40. She came into the office on Monday with the specific, energized exhaustion of someone who has done something that mattered and hasn't fully recovered from it yet. Damien asked how it went. She thought about it for a moment. One kid, she said, 12 years old. He finished the project 45 minutes early and spent the rest of the time trying to find vulnerabilities in the system he'd just built. She paused. That's the one. That's exactly who this is for. He watched her face when she said it and thought about Charlotte Hayes at 12 in South Baltimore and the pipeline problem that started there, and the 20 years between that girl and the woman standing in his office who had spent 3 hours on a Saturday morning handing something forward. How many workshops this quarter, he said. 4 confirmed, working on a 5th. She was already turning toward her office. The Kellerman post-integration audit is on your desk. I flagged 2 anomalies in the data classification that need your sign-off before noon. Charlotte, he said. She stopped. He came around from behind the desk. He stood in front of her and she looked up at him with the clear, assessing eyes that had been looking at him for 7 months and reading him more accurately than anyone had since his father died. You built something good, he said. This morning. That kid. That's yours. She held his gaze for a moment. Something moved through her face, not the professional composure and not the stripped-down operational expression. The thing underneath both of those, which he had learned to recognize and which was, he thought, the truest version of her, the one that existed before she'd learned to armor it. We built something good, she said, quietly, precisely. He looked at her. She reached up and straightened his tie, which didn't need straightening, and let her hand rest for a moment against his chest. And then she went to her office and closed the door, and he stood in the space she'd left, and the city did its indifferent, ongoing thing outside the window. 2 years moved, the way years move when a life has structure and purpose, and the specific gravity of people who have decided to stay. Logan Mercer filed 3 appeals. All 3 were denied. He remained in federal prison at a facility in Pennsylvania, and his name appeared occasionally in legal filings that Charlotte's attorney tracked on her behalf. And each time it appeared, she reviewed the filing and confirmed it was routine and went back to work. She did not think about him often. When she did, it was with the flat, settled quality of someone who has placed a thing where it belongs and left it there. Marco Vitelli pleaded to reduce charges in exchange for cooperation and received 18 years. 3 other syndicate members implicated in the fraud operation were removed through Damien's internal compliance process and referred to federal authorities. The syndicate's financial architecture was restructured again, this time with Charlotte's indirect involvement. She never touched anything that wasn't legitimate, but she designed the compliance framework that made the legitimate face genuinely impenetrable, and the result was an organization that Damien's attorneys described as the cleanest documented private financial network they had ever reviewed. That description contained the specific irony of things that were true in all their technical accuracy and incomplete in their full picture, which was fine. Complete pictures were for people with nothing left to protect. The Hayes Foundation ran 4 programs by the end of the first year, 7 by the end of the second. Charlotte hired 2 full-time program directors and partnered with 3 school districts. The 12-year-old from the South Bronx workshop came back every Saturday for 8 months, and then was accepted to a specialized high school for technology and science, and sent Charlotte a text that said, "I got in," and she forwarded it to Damien without comment, and he read it, and felt something he was not going to name in a text message. They married in September, 2 years and 1 month after a server room door blew open on the 41st floor of a building in Manhattan. The ceremony was at the Moretti Estate in the Hudson Valley, the house that had needed work and had received it, the field behind it cut and the tree line unchanged, the stone and timber of the thing settled into itself in the particular way of structures that have finally been given a reason. 41 people attended. No reporters knew about it. Priya was there, Ramirez was there, Elena Vasquez was there. 6 men who were Damien's in the oldest sense of that word were there, and they were indistinguishable from the corporate executives unless you knew what you were looking at. Charlotte wore something simple and dark ivory and carried nothing because she had never been a woman who needed things in her hands to feel steady. She walked to Damien through the afternoon light of the Hudson Valley, and she looked at him the way she looked at everything, fully, clearly, without performance. And he looked back the same way. The officiant asked the standard questions. They both said yes. There was dinner, and there was the specific warmth of 41 people who were there because they had earned the right to be. And there was the house with its light on and the valley outside going blue and amber in the September evening. Late, after the guests had moved inside, Charlotte and Damien stood on the back porch where they had sat with blankets 2 Novembers ago and looked at the field and the tree line and the sky above it doing its enormous upstate thing. She had her glass in one hand and his arm in the other, and she was leaning slightly into him in the way she'd been leaning into him for 2 years, which was the same way she did everything, not because she needed the support, but because she had decided she wanted the contact and had simply allowed herself to have it. "I keep thinking about Sandra," she said. He waited. From the trial. "The woman who thanked me." She looked at the field. "I think about what would have happened if no one had come through that door. If I'd been alone in that room." She paused. "Not in the way you think. I'm not living in it. I just think about the shape of what would have been lost." "Tell me," he said. She gestured vaguely with her glass at the house, at the valley, at the unseen city 2 hours south where 16 kids were learning network architecture on Saturdays. "This," she said, "all of this, everything that came after." She looked at him. "One locked door on the wrong night, and none of it exists." He looked at her. "But the door opened." "The door opened," she agreed. He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and they stood in the September air with the valley going dark around them and the light from the house reaching across the porch and the distant sound of their guests inside. And the world continued its work with the same indifferent, unstoppable momentum it always had. And inside that momentum, against all the available odds of the last 2 years, something had survived and taken root and become itself. Their daughter was born the following April. They named her Emma. She had Charlotte's eyes, the clear, assessing quality of them, the tendency to look at a thing fully before reacting. Damien noticed this when she was 3 days old and said so, and Charlotte said she also has your jawline, which is not ideal for a daughter because it means she's going to be completely immovable when she decides something, and Damien said, "I know where she gets that from." And Charlotte looked at him over the baby's head with the expression that was not quite a smile and was better than one. The years settled into themselves. Blackridge Technologies became something Charlotte had helped make, and that bore her influence in its architecture and its practices, and the specific culture it had developed of taking its own compliance seriously, because the person who had built the compliance framework was also the person who had found what happened when it was absent. The Hayes Foundation grew. The pipeline it was building would not show its full results for a decade, which was fine. Charlotte understood timelines. She understood that the most important work was work that didn't announce itself immediately. Damien ran what he ran. He ran it the way he had decided to run it, with the specific code he had built from the wreckage of what his father left him, which required that the people under his protection were genuinely protected, that the harm the organization caused was contained and deliberate and never arbitrary, and that the line between what he was and what he could justify was one he crossed rarely and knowingly and never without cost. He was not a good man in the clean sense. He was a precise man, and precision had gotten him to something he could live with, which was perhaps the most honest definition of the thing that most people called goodness when they weren't looking at it too closely. On a Tuesday evening in November, 4 years after a server room, and 2 years after a wedding, and 7 months after Emma Moretti came into the world with her mother's eyes and her father's jaw, the three of them were in the kitchen of the upstate house for the occasion of nothing in particular. Damien was cooking. Charlotte was at the kitchen table with Emma in her lap and a laptop open in front of her that she was not looking at. And Emma was doing the thing she had recently discovered she could do, which was reach up and put her hand flat on her mother's face and then look at what she'd touched with the focused, baffled interest of someone encountering a phenomenon for the first time. Charlotte let her. She sat with her daughter's small hand on her cheek and looked at Damien at the stove, and he looked back at her over his shoulder. "Question," Charlotte said. "Go ahead," he said. "If you could go back," she said, "the server room, everything after, would you?" He turned from the stove. He looked at her at the kitchen table with Emma's hand on her face and the laptop open and the November dark outside the window and the house that had needed work and had received it, holding them. "Every single time," he said. She looked at him for a moment. Emma reached for her mother's hair. Charlotte let her take it, and somewhere south of them the city went on with its enormous, indifferent, unceasing business. And in a federal facility in Pennsylvania, a man was serving the arithmetic of his own choices. And in community centers in 4 boroughs on Saturday mornings, children were learning how systems worked and how to find the places where they didn't. And Damien Moretti turned back to the stove, and Charlotte Hayes rested her chin on her daughter's head. And outside the window, the valley was dark and the stars were doing what stars do, which is shine without asking whether anyone is looking. The woman who nearly died inside a silent server room did not disappear into her own survival. She built things in the space that survival opened up, and she built them with the same precision and clarity and refusal to settle that had made her worth saving in the first place. That was the part that mattered. That was where it ended.